Deep within the thick forests of the Ozark Mountains, hidden from the world for decades, there stood a cabin, a place so isolated that time itself seemed to forget it. Inside, a family of men lived in silence, cut off from the outside world. It wasn't poverty that defined their existence, it was something far darker, something buried in the bloodline of the family, a twisted legacy that would only be revealed when one determined social worker stumbled upon their secrets. On March 17, 1982, social worker Thomas Wilson arrived at that cabin, never anticipating the horror that awaited him inside. What he found there would unravel the tragic history of a family caught in a chilling web of isolation, control, and a bond far too unnatural to ignore. Who were these men, and what unspeakable horrors had kept them hidden for so long? Before we dive deeper into this chilling true story, make sure to hit the like button if you love uncovering forgotten truths. Subscribe for more dark, true stories, and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The cabin, deep in the heart of the Ozark Mountains, had been untouched for decades, hidden from the outside world. Its crumbling walls were the only testament to the family's existence, one veiled in secrecy. The men inside had lived in complete isolation. No one knew them, and they knew no one beyond the thick woods surrounding their home. It was a life cut off from civilization, as if the world had forgotten them. Inside, there were no luxuries. The furniture, worn down by years of use, seemed to be crafted by hand. It was a life that seemed to thrive on simplicity, or perhaps on something darker, far more sinister. The cabin's occupants were three men. Elijah, the oldest, whose features bore the weight of years lived in seclusion. His brother, Thomas, weathered but younger, and the children who had grown up knowing no other world than this one. On March 17, 1982, Thomas Wilson, a social worker, drove down the isolated path that led to the cabin. He'd received an anonymous tip about the men inside, and his mission was clear: ensure their well-being. Or so he thought. As the wheels of his vehicle crunched over the gravel road, a sense of unease gripped his heart. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the stories he had heard painted a grim picture of what might lie ahead. Thomas arrived at the cabin and was greeted by Elijah. The man was tall, gaunt, with pale eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many years spent in solitude. There was something unsettling about him from the very first moment. The atmosphere inside the cabin was oppressive. Elijah led him into the dimly lit room, where the flickering oil lamps cast long shadows across the wooden floors. The children sat quietly, their eyes hollow, their stares unblinking. There was no warmth between them, no laughter, no life. The men spoke in slow, measured tones, as though every word was weighed with years of silence. It was in this silence that the unease began to grow. Thomas's attention shifted to the children. They seemed too quiet, too still, like they were waiting for something to happen. He couldn't help but notice how similar they looked to Elijah. There was something unsettling in their shared appearance. Thomas inquired about their mother, but Elijah simply responded, "She died when the youngest was born." The words were flat, emotionless, as if the death of their mother didn't matter. But something in Elijah's voice made Thomas feel uneasy. He noticed the closeness between the children and Elijah. It wasn't a typical bond of father and child. There was a strange familiarity, an unsettling attachment that made Thomas wonder if there was something more to their story. The more Thomas observed, the more questions arose. The way the children moved, the way they looked at Elijah, suggested a life that had been lived in complete isolation, one where the line between family roles and something darker blurred. Thomas spent hours asking questions, trying to piece together the truth. The answers were vague, unconvincing. Elijah's answers were always the same, always flat. The more he learned, the more Thomas felt a sense of impending dread. The children's health was another concern. They showed signs of neglect, though not physical abuse. There was a certain hollowness in their movements, a stiffness in their faces that suggested an emotional trauma that ran deeper than neglect. Elijah grew defensive as the questioning continued. His eyes narrowed and his body stiffened. He was a man hardened by years of isolation, and any attempt to breach the silence of the cabin was met with suspicion. Thomas left the cabin that day with more questions than answers. His gut told him that something was deeply wrong. There was more to this family, more to their story than he had been able to uncover. In the days that followed, Thomas continued his investigation. He dug through county records, searching for any sign of the family's existence outside the cabin. But the more he searched, the less he found. The records were strangely incomplete. There were no birth certificates for the children, no proof of their existence before they had come to live in the cabin. It was as though they had been erased from history, left out of the system entirely. Thomas returned to the cabin with a colleague, hoping for a breakthrough. He brought along a sheriff's deputy and a doctor, a man who could examine the children and confirm his suspicions about their neglect. The answers, however, were far more disturbing. As they approached the cabin, the same eerie silence greeted them. The children appeared in the doorway, their faces vacant, their eyes wide and unblinking. It was as though they had been waiting for them, anticipating their arrival. The doctor performed a basic examination, noting the children's poor health. Their teeth were decayed, their growth stunted. But there was no evidence of physical abuse, no signs that could definitively point to neglect. Yet, there was an undeniable psychological damage. The children were disconnected from the world, unable to interact with those outside their immediate family. They were emotionally frozen, as though their development had been stunted by something far more sinister than mere neglect. With each passing visit, Thomas grew more certain that something darker was at play. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, a prison created by the men to control and manipulate the children within their walls. The investigation into the secluded cabin continued to stir unease in Thomas. The more he uncovered, the more disturbing it became. Elijah, the head of the household, seemed to hide something, an underlying tension that was impossible to ignore. Elijah spoke little, his eyes constantly shifting between his children and Thomas. The man had a distant air about him, as if he were more an observer of life than a participant in it. There was an unsettling calmness. Thomas began to feel that this wasn't a simple case of neglect or poverty. The strange bond between Elijah and the children hinted at something deeper, something that went beyond traditional family dynamics and bordered on the unnatural. The cabin, as Thomas observed, was far from ordinary. Its walls, heavy with years of neglect, seemed to hold an oppressive weight. It wasn't just the lack of luxury, it was as if time had stopped there. Elijah's attempts to downplay any concerns about the children were not convincing. Thomas noticed their behavior, their stiff, almost robotic movements. There was something trapped behind their vacant expressions, a silence that clung to the air. Despite the apparent neglect, the children didn't seem to fear Elijah. It was as if they were conditioned to accept their place in this strange world, a world where they were locked away from everything else. Thomas left the cabin on that first visit with an unsettling sense of dread. His thoughts were consumed by the children's hauntingly similar appearance and the way Elijah refused to explain their mysterious background. It didn't sit right. Days passed, but Thomas couldn't shake the images of the children, their blank stares, and the disturbing silence that hung over the cabin. He needed answers, and he couldn't ignore the suspicion growing in the pit of his stomach. As Thomas returned to the town, he dove deeper into the Shelton family's history. Records were scarce, but the more he dug, the more the family seemed to vanish from history, like they'd never existed at all. The more Thomas searched, the more gaps appeared. There were no birth certificates, no hospital records, and no evidence that the children had ever been legally documented. It was as though they were invisible to the world. Thomas's unease grew into a gnawing certainty. There was something seriously wrong with this family. Elijah's behavior was odd, defensive, and erratic when questioned, and the children were disturbingly disconnected from the world around them. Determined to find answers, Thomas visited the cabin again, this time with a deputy and a medical professional. He needed someone with more experience to assess the children's health, but nothing could have prepared him for what they'd find. As the trio arrived, the familiar silence greeted them. The children were there, just as before, staring at them with wide, lifeless eyes. They didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if they were waiting for something. The doctor examined the children, but nothing seemed physically wrong with them, at least not on the surface. Yet the emotional and psychological damage was unmistakable. They were disconnected from the world, as though it had no meaning for them. The deputy spoke little, but his expression mirrored Thomas's growing suspicion. The isolation these children had endured was unlike anything either of them had seen before. This wasn't simple neglect. It was something far more sinister. Elijah's presence in the cabin remained an eerie constant. Every question posed to him was met with the same flat, emotionless responses. There were no answers. There was only silence, a silence that spoke volumes about the twisted family dynamic. Thomas's growing concern led him to research Elijah's background. It was then that he uncovered more unsettling details. The family's isolation wasn't just a recent development. It had been ingrained in them for generations. The more Thomas learned, the clearer it became that Elijah and his children had been raised in an environment where normal boundaries were blurred. There were no rules outside the cabin, no connections to the world beyond, just an unspoken belief in isolation. Thomas's investigation soon uncovered the disturbing legacy of the Shelton family. Elijah's upbringing had been shaped by generations of isolation and secrecy. It was a belief system that had become ingrained in him, one that was passed down through the generations. The discovery was chilling. Elijah's relationship with his children wasn't just one of neglect. It was the result of a twisted belief in family purity, one that isolated them from the world, teaching them to fear it. Thomas began to understand that the children weren't just neglected. They were trapped in a cycle of isolation that had been passed down through the generations. The walls of the cabin weren't just physical, they were psychological, and they had shaped the men and children within. As the investigation deepened, Thomas became more determined to find a way to break the cycle. The children were in danger, not just from neglect, but from the psychological damage they'd endured for so long. Thomas knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time since arriving at the cabin, he felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out there, and he would uncover it, no matter the cost. Thomas had received an anonymous tip about the Shelton family, and his task was simple: ensure the well-being of the children living in the isolated cabin. Little did he know how unsettling the truth would be. He wasn't prepared for the eerie atmosphere that greeted him upon his arrival. The path leading to the cabin was overgrown with weeds, barely visible, as if nature itself had tried to hide the family from the outside world. When Thomas knocked, Elijah opened the door with a hollow gaze. His unshaven face and cold demeanor hinted at a life of deep isolation. Elijah spoke in flat tones, his words deliberate but lacking warmth. Thomas asked about the family's living conditions, and Elijah spoke of survival. The cabin was simple, with no electricity or running water. It seemed as if the family had been living off the land for years, without concern for the world outside. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of damp wood. There were signs of neglect everywhere, but no immediate evidence of physical abuse. The real concern lay beneath the surface, the emotional isolation of the family. The children, 2 boys, Thomas observed, sat in silence, their faces unreadable. They didn't speak, nor did they move much. They were frozen, as if waiting for something to happen, but not sure what that something was. Thomas tried to engage them, but they only glanced at him, their eyes dull and distant. Their appearance mirrored Elijah's, a coldness, a disconnect from everything outside the cabin. It wasn't neglect, it was something much darker. The eldest boy, around 12 years old, had a scar on his arm, a faint trace of an old injury. He didn't flinch when Thomas looked at it, his gaze never leaving Elijah. It was as if they shared the same sense of detachment. Curiosity grew inside Thomas as he observed the father-son dynamic. Elijah was distant, not affectionate, but the children didn't seem to need affection. They appeared conditioned to accept things as they were, trapped in a world of isolation. When Thomas asked about their mother, Elijah's face went blank. He explained that she died during childbirth, a simple statement with no emotion. There was no photograph, no mention of a name. The children's mother seemed to have never existed. The children's odd behavior only deepened Thomas's suspicion. They were too quiet, too distant. Their eyes seemed to reflect a world they had never been allowed to experience, a world beyond the cabin, one that didn't exist for them. After spending a few hours there, Thomas left with a growing sense of unease. His instinct told him something was very wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the silence in that cabin, the eerie quiet between father and sons, spoke volumes. That night, Thomas began researching the Shelton family. The more he searched, the less he found. There were no birth records, no history of the family before the fire in 1973 that had killed their supposed parents. They seemed to have never existed before then. The search was maddening. It was as if Elijah and his children had erased themselves from existence, deliberately hiding from the world. The family was a mystery, and Thomas could feel the weight of that mystery pressing down on him. The next day, he returned to the cabin, this time with a sheriff's deputy and a doctor, hoping to uncover more about the children's health. Elijah was less welcoming this time, his defensiveness growing with each question Thomas posed. Inside, the cabin felt heavier, more oppressive than before. The children sat in the same positions, not moving, not acknowledging the new visitors. The doctor performed basic tests, but there were no clear signs of abuse or neglect beyond the children's emotional detachment. Elijah grew more agitated as the questions continued. He seemed uncomfortable with any intrusion into his family's world. Thomas couldn't ignore the suspicion growing in his chest. This wasn't just a case of neglect. It was far more complex. The doctor's examination showed no major health issues, but the children's behavior was another matter. They were emotionally stunted, unable to interact with anyone outside their family unit. They had no real connection to the outside world. Thomas spoke with the deputy afterward, both of them agreeing that there was more to this family than they had initially realized. The emotional isolation was extreme, but Thomas couldn't yet piece together the full picture of what was happening. As Thomas left, his mind raced. He had to get to the bottom of this. The children were in danger, but from what? It wasn't just the isolation, it was the psychological toll this life had taken on them. The investigation would take time, but Thomas knew one thing for sure. The family's secrets ran deeper than he had imagined. Elijah's control over his children was just the surface of a much darker, more disturbing reality. Thomas's growing unease led him to believe that the Shelton family's situation was more than just isolation. There was something in the air, something heavy, a chilling silence that spoke volumes about their lives. Elijah remained an enigma. He never offered much in terms of explanation, and his behavior became increasingly erratic as Thomas's questioning grew more persistent. It was clear that Elijah wanted to keep his world intact, untouched. The children were still silent. Their vacant stares pierced through Thomas, yet they seemed to have no desire to engage with anyone outside their confined reality. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the way Elijah treated the children. The coldness in his interactions with them made it seem like they were more of a possession than loved ones. There was no warmth, no affection. The longer Thomas stayed, the more questions piled up. Elijah's answers became more cryptic. The mention of their mother was always brushed aside. There was no proof of her existence, no signs of grief in Elijah's eyes. The children, too, were an enigma. Thomas couldn't understand how they had grown up in such a cold environment without questioning it. Their ability to accept their father's strange, detached manner left him feeling deeply unsettled. Thomas noticed that the cabin seemed to hold a quiet power, like it was more than just a home. It was a prison. The children were confined not just by the walls, but by something far more controlling. The silence between Elijah and his sons spoke volumes. There was no conversation between them, no real connection. Elijah controlled everything, from what the children did to how they felt. It was an unnerving dynamic to witness. As days went by, Thomas observed the children more closely. Their behavior seemed practiced, almost mechanical. They weren't just isolated. They were conditioned to act in a way that kept the status quo intact. The emotional toll on the children was apparent. Thomas could see it in their eyes, the lost expression of those who had never known love, never experienced the world outside. They were trapped, stuck in a warped reality. One afternoon, Thomas sat with Elijah, hoping to learn more about the children's past. He spoke carefully, trying not to provoke the father. But Elijah remained vague, speaking only of the hardships they had faced in isolation. There was no mention of a community or any ties to the world outside. Elijah's version of reality was contained within the walls of the cabin, and Thomas realized that to Elijah, the outside world didn't exist. The more Thomas learned, the more disturbing it became. Elijah didn't just keep his children isolated physically. He had instilled in them a belief system that made them fear everything outside their cabin. It was like a cult. The children's complete detachment was both tragic and terrifying. They had never known anything other than their father's rigid control. They seemed incapable of thinking beyond the world Elijah had shaped for them. It was all they had ever known. As Thomas considered the situation, he realized how difficult it would be to break the Shelton family's cycle of isolation. The children were so mentally conditioned that even the simplest questions seemed to leave them confused. Every time Thomas asked about the children's lives before the cabin, Elijah would deflect the conversation. The more he avoided answering, the more it became clear. The past was something Elijah didn't want to discuss. It was buried for a reason. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the family's isolation was rooted in something more insidious than just a desire to live off the land. There was a deep, psychological control that Elijah had cultivated, a suffocating grip on his children. The longer Thomas spent at the cabin, the more it became evident that the children weren't just neglected. They were emotionally stunted by their father's control. Their world was confined not by walls, but by a warped belief system. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken words. Elijah never said much, but his silence was powerful. He controlled everything without ever raising his voice. It was as if he had mastered the art of silent dominance. As Thomas made his way back to town, he couldn't stop thinking about the children. Their strange, eerie silence, the way they interacted, or rather didn't interact, with the world outside, haunted him. It was a silence that felt suffocating. Thomas returned to the cabin, determined to break through Elijah's wall of silence. The more he thought about the family's strange behavior, the more convinced he became that something deeper was at play. Every visit, Elijah's cold demeanor grew more unsettling. The family's strange silence continued, but now it felt like an impenetrable barrier. It was as if the very air in the cabin was designed to keep outsiders away. The children continued to observe everything in complete silence. They seemed to anticipate Elijah's every move, watching his every action as if they were conditioned to do so. There was no freedom in their gaze. Thomas's growing frustration boiled over. The isolation was starting to take a visible toll on him. He couldn't understand how these children had been conditioned to accept this life without question. Where was their curiosity, their desire to explore? It was clear now that breaking the silence wasn't just about asking the right questions. It was about forcing Elijah to face something he had spent years burying. But how could Thomas crack through years of psychological conditioning? Thomas spent hours in his room studying the files he had gathered. The more he read, the more he realized how deeply rooted the family's isolation was. This wasn't just neglect. It was systematic control. When Thomas returned to the cabin once more, he brought with him a deputy and a doctor. He knew that he had to get the children to trust him, but he also needed to confront Elijah with the truth of their situation. As he approached the cabin, a feeling of dread washed over him. The men in the cabin had been living in their own world for so long, it felt like they might fight to keep that world intact, no matter the cost. Inside, Elijah was as quiet as ever, but there was a subtle change in his demeanor. He didn't seem as defensive as before, perhaps because he knew that Thomas wasn't going to leave without answers. The doctor began his examination of the children, noting their physical health. Though they weren't malnourished, their emotional state was another matter. The doctor's concerns deepened as he realized how emotionally underdeveloped they were. Elijah watched the doctor's every move with a cold gaze. He spoke little, only providing short, emotionless answers. But it was clear that he was uncomfortable with the intrusion, though he refused to speak against it. As Thomas continued his questioning, the silence between him and Elijah felt more oppressive. Every word was like an unspoken challenge. Elijah's eyes narrowed as if warning Thomas to stop probing too deeply into their lives. Despite the tension in the air, the doctor remained focused on the children. They weren't physically hurt, but the emotional damage was overwhelming. It was clear to him that this family was trapped in an emotional prison of Elijah's making. Thomas left the cabin with a growing sense of urgency. The situation was more serious than he had anticipated. The children's emotional state was deteriorating, and Elijah's control over them was becoming more evident with each visit. In the days that followed, Thomas spent countless hours looking into the family's past. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Elijah's upbringing had been just as isolated and distorted as the world he had created for his sons. It was then that Thomas realized the full extent of the psychological manipulation at play. The family wasn't just cut off from the world, they had been conditioned to believe that the outside world was dangerous, corrupt, and unworthy of their attention. Elijah's insistence on isolating his children was rooted in fear. The family's twisted belief system, one of purity and protection, had taught them to view the outside world as a threat. Everything outside the cabin was considered corrupt. Thomas understood now that breaking the cycle wasn't just about rescuing the children. It was about confronting the very foundation of the beliefs that had shaped Elijah's world and stripping away the control he had over them. With this realization, Thomas knew that the fight ahead would be far more complicated than he had imagined. It wasn't just a matter of removing the children from the cabin. It was about freeing them from the mental chains that had bound them for so long. As Thomas continued his investigation into the Shelton family, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The more he uncovered, the darker the truth became, and the more he realized how deep the family's isolation ran. Every step forward revealed more about Elijah's twisted belief system. It wasn't just about survival, it was about control. The family's isolation wasn't a choice. It was a form of psychological imprisonment, passed down through generations. Thomas's mind raced as he pieced together the family's history. Elijah's parents, Harold and Edith, had raised him to believe that the outside world was dangerous, corrupt, and full of lies. Their influence had shaped everything Elijah did. The more Thomas uncovered, the clearer it became that Elijah wasn't simply following in his parents' footsteps. He had embraced their twisted teachings, perpetuating them in his own family. The isolation had become a prison for them all. The children, especially, had been raised in a world where normal human relationships were forbidden. Their entire lives had been shaped by the belief that their father's control was the only thing standing between them and a corrupt world. Thomas began to realize the full scope of Elijah's control. The man had molded his children into mirrors of his own beliefs. They had no connection to the outside world, no understanding of what life could be beyond the cabin. The more Thomas learned, the more disturbing the family's history became. Elijah and his siblings had been taught to fear the outside world, to view anyone who wasn't part of their bloodline as a threat to their way of life. The beliefs that had been ingrained in Elijah and his siblings had been passed down like a curse. They viewed their isolation as sacred, a way of protecting their bloodline from the corruption of the outside world. As Thomas uncovered more about Elijah's upbringing, he began to see how the man's actions were driven by fear. Elijah wasn't just controlling his children, he was trying to protect them from what he believed was a dangerous world. Thomas realized that the psychological damage done to Elijah's children was far worse than he had imagined. They weren't just emotionally stunted, they were victims of a belief system that had stripped them of their humanity. The more Thomas discovered, the more he understood how deeply the Shelton family's isolation had affected them. The children had been raised in an environment where the truth was distorted, and the outside world was painted as an evil to be feared. Elijah's world wasn't just one of isolation, it was one of complete mental control. He had created a bubble, a reality where his beliefs were the only truth, and the outside world was an enemy that must be kept out at all costs. Thomas felt the weight of what he had uncovered. The longer he stayed, the more certain he became that the family couldn't be left to live in their isolated world. The children needed help, but breaking Elijah's control would be a challenge. The deeper Thomas dug into the Shelton family's history, the more he understood how generational the damage was. It wasn't just Elijah's twisted beliefs that had shaped his family's life. It was a cycle of fear and control that had lasted for decades. With each revelation, Thomas grew more determined to break the cycle. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but the children had been trapped in their own prison for too long. They deserved a chance to live freely. The truth was darker than Thomas had anticipated. This wasn't just a family trapped in isolation. It was a family that had been conditioned to believe that their way of life was the only way, that everyone else was corrupt. As Thomas processed everything he had learned, he understood that breaking the cycle of control wasn't just about removing the children from the cabin. It was about teaching them that there was a world beyond their father's twisted beliefs. Thomas now understood the gravity of what lay ahead. The children had been conditioned their entire lives to believe their father's twisted version of reality. If they were to have any chance at healing, they would need to be shown a new way of life. Thomas's resolve grew stronger with each passing day. The more he uncovered about the Shelton family, the more it became apparent that the children were trapped in a world of psychological manipulation, and he had to intervene. With the truth now exposed, Thomas knew the battle to free the children from their father's control would not be easy. Elijah was not someone who would let go of his power over his sons without a fight. The law seemed ill-equipped to handle the situation. There were no obvious signs of physical abuse, just a deeply rooted psychological manipulation that had shaped the Shelton family's existence for generations. It was a complex case. Thomas knew that to save the children, he would need to build a case that went beyond neglect. He needed evidence of the emotional and psychological damage Elijah had inflicted on them, but that wasn't going to be easy. As he began reaching out to other professionals, Thomas found that the case was being met with resistance. The town had always turned a blind eye to the Sheltons. The family's isolation had kept them hidden for so long. The longer Thomas spent with the children, the more it became clear how deeply ingrained the emotional manipulation was. They didn't just view their father's word as law, they feared the world outside more than anything else. Thomas tried to talk to the children more directly, but their responses were always vague, almost robotic. They had no understanding of a world beyond their father's teachings. They saw the outside world as a threat, just as Elijah had taught them. The more Thomas pressed, the more it seemed that the children were conditioned not to speak of their experiences, as though any mention of the world outside the cabin was forbidden. Their silence was a form of protection. Elijah, meanwhile, grew more hostile. He accused Thomas of attempting to tear apart his family, of poisoning his children's minds with lies about the outside world. His fear was palpable, and it was clear he would fight tooth and nail to keep them. Thomas knew that if he was going to save the children, he needed to do so quickly. But he had to navigate a legal system that seemed unwilling to take action unless there was concrete evidence of abuse. Every time he visited the cabin, Thomas could feel the tension rising. Elijah's hostility was clear, but there was also a sense of desperation in his eyes, as though he knew the control he had over his children was slipping away. The children's fear was evident. It was in the way they avoided eye contact, in their hesitation to speak, as if they were constantly waiting for Elijah's approval. They were caught between wanting to trust Thomas and the fear of disobeying their father. But even in the face of this fear, Thomas saw glimpses of something else, a spark of curiosity. It wasn't much, but it was there. The children were capable of something beyond the prison Elijah had created for them. They just needed the chance. Over the following days, Thomas met with lawyers, social workers, and anyone who could help him build a case against Elijah. But every step forward seemed to bring new obstacles. The town's indifference to the family's isolation was a powerful force. The more Thomas pushed, the more he felt the weight of the system's reluctance to intervene. Elijah's control over his children was subtle, but it was powerful. It wasn't just about removing them from the cabin. It was about breaking the belief system that had imprisoned them. As the battle for the children's future continued, Thomas realized that he wasn't just fighting for their physical safety. He was fighting for their minds, their ability to understand the world in a way they had never been allowed to. In the quiet moments, when Elijah wasn't around, Thomas would talk to the children. He asked them about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. They didn't answer much, but the mere act of speaking with them seemed to give them a taste of freedom. Thomas knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he couldn't give up. The children deserved a life beyond the cabin, beyond the walls Elijah had built. He would do whatever it took to help them escape. As Thomas pressed forward with the investigation, the legal system became a formidable obstacle. Despite the mounting evidence of emotional manipulation, there was still no concrete proof to remove the children from the cabin. The legal battle seemed impossible. Elijah's deep control over his sons was difficult to prove in a court of law. Without physical abuse or documented neglect, the law was reluctant to take action against him. Thomas began to feel the weight of the bureaucracy that surrounded him. The town was reluctant to challenge Elijah's authority, and every effort to intervene was met with resistance. The town had long accepted the family's isolation. Elijah's control over the family was subtle, but it was undeniable. His emotional manipulation, his ability to isolate and condition his sons, made it nearly impossible to prove abuse. The legal system couldn't handle the complexity. As the case moved through the courts, Thomas's frustration grew. He knew the children were in danger, but the system wasn't designed to protect them from a psychological prison. Elijah's control was invisible to the law. Even as the case gained attention, the community continued to remain silent. Elijah's family had been part of the landscape for decades, and there were those who believed that the Sheltons had the right to live however they chose. Thomas's job was not just to expose the abuse. It was to convince the system that the children were victims of something far worse than neglect. It was a fight against an invisible force, one that had shaped their lives. Elijah, of course, played his part. He denied everything, portraying himself as a protective father doing what was best for his children. He maintained his stoic, emotionless stance throughout the proceedings, his belief in his own righteousness unwavering. The case became a battle not just for the children's safety, but for their very future. Elijah's twisted belief system had shaped their entire worldview. The children needed more than protection. They needed a new understanding of the world. Despite the mounting pressure, the legal proceedings were slow, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The children were deteriorating emotionally with each passing day, and Elijah's grip on them was growing stronger. As Thomas worked with social workers, legal experts, and psychologists, the reality of the situation became more apparent. The children weren't just isolated physically. They were mentally imprisoned by their father's control, unable to see a world outside of his teachings. Elijah's stubbornness was both a curse and a shield. He refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, claiming that his actions were motivated by love and protection. To him, the outside world was the real danger, not the isolation he had created. For Thomas, the hardest part was knowing that the children were being torn between their father's authority and their own desire for freedom. They were trapped in a psychological tug-of-war, unable to break free from the world Elijah had built. It was during this time that Thomas realized the true scope of the problem. The family's isolation wasn't just a result of Elijah's actions. It was part of a larger pattern of behavior that had been passed down through generations. Elijah's manipulation went beyond simple control. It was a belief system, one that kept his children in fear of the world and reliant on him for survival. It was a system that had shaped their every thought, every action. The more Thomas learned, the more he realized that breaking this system would take time. It wasn't just about rescuing the children physically. It was about breaking their mental and emotional chains, helping them understand that they were free to think for themselves. As the trial continued, Thomas became more determined. He knew the children had a long road ahead of them, and the legal struggle would be just the beginning. But he wasn't willing to let Elijah's twisted beliefs continue to control them. The trial against Elijah Shelton dragged on, but a sense of progress began to emerge. The children, though still trapped in their father's belief system, were slowly beginning to show signs of change. Despite the slow pace of legal proceedings, there was a glimmer of hope. Thomas had worked tirelessly to ensure the children's safety, and though the system had failed them for so long, he was determined to see justice done. The children's emotional recovery would be a long, difficult process, but the first steps were being made. Thomas had arranged for therapy, ensuring the children would be exposed to the outside world in a safe and controlled environment. It was clear, however, that the children would need more than therapy. They needed to relearn how to live in the world outside the cabin. They had been raised in isolation, unable to comprehend normal social structures. Thomas watched as the children adapted, though slowly. Thomas, who had always worked with children in the past, knew how difficult it would be to help them overcome years of emotional manipulation and isolation. Thomas met with the children regularly, helping them adjust to their new reality. The children's silence was still a barrier, but it was less oppressive. There were moments when they looked at him with curiosity, as though beginning to trust. The children's ability to learn was evident. Thomas was encouraged by their willingness to engage with new ideas and concepts. They were starting to ask questions, something they had never been allowed to do before. It was a breakthrough when the eldest child, Thomas's namesake, spoke up for the first time. He asked in a soft voice what the outside world was like. It was the first sign of hope Thomas had seen in weeks. The journey wasn't easy. The children were still haunted by the fear instilled in them by their father's teachings. But with each session, with each new word spoken, they were slowly breaking free from the psychological chains of isolation. Elijah's trial, however, continued to drag on. Despite the evidence of emotional manipulation and isolation, the legal system remained slow to act. Thomas felt the weight of the battle as Elijah remained steadfast in his refusal to admit any wrongdoing. But the children's progress was undeniable. They began to interact more with other children, though they struggled with the social cues that most children learned in their early years. The world was new to them, and it was overwhelming. As the children adjusted to their new life, Thomas worked tirelessly to ensure their well-being. He made sure they had access to everything they needed, therapy, education, and social opportunities, to help them adapt to a life they had never known. Though the legal fight was far from over, Thomas found solace in the children's progress. Each day they seemed to take one more step toward freedom. It was a long road ahead, but they were no longer trapped. The day finally came when Elijah was sentenced. He was found guilty of emotional abuse and manipulation, but the verdict came with a sense of bittersweet justice. The children had been freed, but their scars would never fully heal. In the months that followed, the children continued their recovery. Thomas worked with them every day, helping them build a new life. The bond they had once shared with their father was broken, and they were free to begin again. For the children, the journey had just begun. They would never forget the isolation, the fear, or the teachings they had grown up with. But Thomas knew that, with time, they would rebuild. They would thrive. The Shelton cabin, once a symbol of isolation and fear, was abandoned and left to decay. The land, once a prison for Elijah and his children, was slowly being reclaimed by nature. The cycle had been broken. Thomas watched as the children moved forward, knowing that their future was no longer defined by the darkness of their past. They had a chance to live, to grow, to be free. And that was all that mattered.